welcome to this episode of the Theology Pugcast. It's great to have you with us. I am C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve a church right outside Portland, Oregon, and I am a senior editor at Touchstone Magazine. Tom, go ahead and introduce yourself.
I'm Tom Price. I teach theology, Christian ethics. One of the places is Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and I'm part of the ordained diaconate and serve a church in Connecticut.
Great. So, Glenn, this is your show today, so why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and then take us right into the subject of the day.
Okay, I'm Glenn Sunshine. I am a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I work at Reflections Ministries under Ken Boa, and I have my own ministry, Every Square Inch Ministries. But for present purposes, the most important part of my background is I am a retired history professor specializing in Renaissance and Reformation Europe. And we're going to really start with the Renaissance in a lot of ways today. But before I get there, I just want to point out a few things. I am sitting currently in my dry bar.
Yeah, cool.
So you can see the background there. And over my left shoulder, you will see a pug on the wall.
Yeah.
This was given to me by one of our listeners, Jason Gortney. And Jason, if you're watching this rather than just listening, I want to acknowledge the pug and your gift. So thank you.
Yeah.
Jason's a great guy.
Yeah,
yes,
I got one as well. Still finding the perfect place for it, but it is it's a treasure.
Right.
Our jumping off place for today is an article that just came out, I think literally the day we're recording this, in the Imaginative Conservative, called Seeking Christendom, Christian Humanism in the 20th Century by Bradley Birzer. Now, being a Renaissance historian, I can't start with Christian humanism in the 20th century. Mm-hmm. We need to go back 700 years or so to look at the origins of humanism, what it was, and what Christian humanism was in my period, 16th century really, how the word changes in definition. And we need all of that in place to really understand what's going on in the Christian humanism Birzer is talking about. So let's start off with the definition of humanism in the Renaissance. Well, first of all, there's no humanism. There are humanists. And the word humanism is created to describe this movement in the 19th century. But a humanist in Italy, an humanista, was a scholar specializing in the humanities. Now, today we use liberal arts and humanities almost synonymously. But in the Middle Ages, the liberal arts were a set of 7 subjects, which I'm not going to go through. The humanities were a reduced curriculum with some differences from the liberal arts. And the reason why the Italian humanists came along is they didn't like the direction education was taking. They didn't like the emphasis on dialectic or logic. They didn't like scholasticism. They didn't like the way they approached texts, all of these kinds of things. So what you have is a different collection of subjects, specifically grammar, which means basically all language, basic language principles, rhetoric, the ability to use language to good effect, history, and poetry. Those were the core subjects in the humanities. One other, I know I skipped one, moral philosophy, specifically moral philosophy or ethics. Those were the core subjects. They thought this was a far more practical foundation for education. One of the more important things that they did, though, is they changed the way texts were studied. In the Middle Ages, in the scholastic system, if you were going to study a text, you never studied the text on its own. You always studied it in connection with a set of standard glosses or summaries and commentaries. And your analysis of the text always took into account what all these other people had said. The humanists come along and they say, you know what? Aristotle didn't have the benefit of the glosses and commentators. He wrote in a way that he expected people to understand him. Maybe we should just look at Aristotle on his own and study what Aristotle meant without recourse to all these other people whose ideas may or may not actually reflect what Aristotle was saying. And so they developed an approach to studying texts, which we still use today. You look at the text, you study its linguistic, rhetorical elements, historical context, all of those kinds of things. So our modern way of studying is really a product of humanism. And I would argue that the Protestant Reformation is as well. Luther was heavily influenced by the humanists. And what happened, I would argue, with Luther is that he took traditional theological questions but answered them using humanist methodology, and that's when justification by faith jumped out. And I can develop that argument more if you really want me to, but fundamentally, that's what I think was going on with Luther, and that's how we get the Reformation, and it's also why most of the Protestant reformers were trained as humanists.
It makes perfect sense to me. I follow you, but that, it might be news to other people that this was like an important development in order for him to see that.
Yeah, real quick, Glenn, and I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but how did the difference between classical, like fourfold method, shift with this humanist method? Because I think that for a lot of people, they only know either the historic grammatical and they see everything wrong with the other approach, but this was a deliberate move away from that approach.
Right. Yeah. In the Middle Ages, they believed that every text in Scripture particularly had 4 different meanings. There's the literal, but then there are 3 types of symbolic meanings attached to it as well. The humanists typically said, I don't think so. And what they would do is they would approach the text and say, the text had a meaning, has a meaning for the people who wrote it, and therefore that's what we should be looking for. Now, in Luther's case, he didn't quite go that far. He did say with the humanists that all Scripture has one meaning. But his hermeneutical principle was Christological, was based on Christ. So he says the New Testament is mostly literal, and the Old Testament is mostly figurative. You read the Old Testament to find Jesus in it. So he's gonna eliminate the fourfold exegesis, but he's going to go to a single meaning, but not the way we do. The grammatical, historical, literal type approaches we use are going to be an evolution from that, but that's where it's going to begin.
Now, of course, knowing the New Testament, you would almost have to do that in the sense that it has to be typological. For example, Paul uses the term types, and then the Lord, on the road to Emmaus says, "This is all about me." So, that takes you right there. And it is true that when you're working with the fourfold approach, it really gets, you're straining at certain points to find.
To force that thing.
Right. Yeah. But anyway.
Yeah. Now, it's worth noting, though, that during the Reformation, you have the Protestants who go in this direction. But even before then, you've got a movement of Christian humanism. These are Catholic thinkers. And when we talk about Christian humanists in the period, we're mostly dealing with Catholics. As a group, as opposed to the Protestant humanists like Calvin or some of the others. But the Christian humanism was, people like Erasmus and others. Its characteristics were the use of humanist methodology to analyze the text, but also they tended to have a disinterest in doctrine. They were interested much more in practicality. How do we clean up the abuses in the church? How do we live a moral life? Those were the things that they were interested in, and they went to the Scripture looking for those. The difference between them and Luther is Luther had interest in the theological questions. So he applied the same methodology but asked different questions.
That's interesting because what you have going on there, if I'm understanding this correctly, is a shift from the contemplative, which is classical, to the practical. And that is why Peter Harrison said the shift in the reading of nature started with the shift in the reading of texts in the 16th century. Because if the practical relationship to nature rather than the contemplative first is done away with, then the levels of inherent meaning are done away with, but the practical gets emphasis. Anyway, I didn't want to lose that.
You have to push that back to the 14th century.
Yeah, Petrarch, that's right.
Who is the father of Renaissance humanism. Petrarch argued for the superiority of the via activa, the active life, over the via contemplativa, the contemplative life. And humanism really came about because Petrarch this movement of the humanista, and with it the entire Renaissance, came about because Petrarch was Petrarch's living with the Black Death occurs in the middle of Petrarch's life. His dates are 1304 to 1374. Black Death hits 1348 in continental Europe, at least. So, and even before that, Europe was in a crisis stage in the 14th century for a whole bunch of different reasons, including things like climate shift, famines, wars. Florence between 1291 and 1434 had 12 different governments, 12 different governmental systems, alternating back and forth between different variations and things like that. I mean, it was a time of incredible instability. And so Petrarch looked at the world around him and said, frankly, it's going to hell in a handbasket. And so he goes back, he's looking for a source of meaning and value and things like that. And he looks at Rome, and he sees Rome as this golden age. And so a lot like the Romantics, he wanted to jump over the stresses of his period to a golden age in the past. And he had, frankly, very little to say positive about his own era. This leads to criticism of education because he's a scholar. And along with that, his emphasis on humanism is it's much more practical than the liberal arts. The liberal arts in this period was built around dialectic, around logic. And Petrarch wanted to make the centerpiece of education rhetoric. And the reason for that is, in his mind, rhetoric was more practical. It could produce results. It could get people to do things. Think about it like this. Have you ever been in an argument with somebody where somebody presented a case that you could not see what was logically wrong with it, but you just weren't convinced by it?
Yeah.
If you haven't, you need to get out more. and that's the problem with logic. It doesn't necessarily convince people. Rhetoric does. That's what rhetoric is designed to do. So he saw all of this as a practical move leading to the active life as spiritually superior to the contemplative life because it's practical, it gets you out into the world and gets you doing things.
Right. It's interesting that many people today would not associate that with humanism. They think of the STEM, sort of STEM subjects as the practical stuff, and something like reading texts and learning rhetoric as being, I don't know, hobbies.
Yeah. Well, Petrarch's answer is that the stem cells or the stem cells.
Well, that's where it ends up.
The STEM subjects are too narrow to be a foundation for real education. That's Petrarch's response, because you had the quadrivium, the mathematically based stuff in the liberal arts.
Well, and you get the fusion with Descartes between the mathematical and the active, and those things tied. That's where you really create a vigorous combination. But the shift to the active. I mean, but you see this in a lot of Protestant approaches to doctrine as well. It no longer becomes first and foremost the transformation through contemplation, and then the refashioning of loves through that love of God, and it becomes doctrine is significant insofar as its ethics. And this takes, of course, this morphs eventually to what we talked about last time, where ethics becomes unmoored from the doctrine. What becomes significant is the moral life, and then the moral life, if it doesn't have teeth, starts to become an expression of our own active self-making. But this shift is huge.
Yeah,
it gets me thinking about.
You won't actually see that, Tom, in the first generations of reformers, first, second generation, third generation. They all focus on the doctrine, but then argue that this also has to be lived out. I mean, that's foundational, early on. The split's going to occur a little later.
Perkin and Baxter, yeah.
So thinking about Mary and Martha, of course, this always brings to mind that particular episode where Mary is commended because she is an embodiment of the contemplative, where she's at the feet of Jesus, she's listening. Martha is the busy person, the type A type person. And so I think our age is pretty much on board with Martha. We live in a Martha world, and we kind of roll our eyes at the Marys around us.
Yeah. Now, back to the period, you have Christian humanists in the 1400s.
Yeah.
Well before the Reformation starts. People like Lorenzo Valla, who's not normally associated with Christian humanism, is a Christian humanist when you actually follow through on what he's doing. Lefebvre d'Etaples in France, who, by the way, was also interested in theology and articulated justification by faith 3 to 5 years before Luther did. There are a number. Erasmus is your prime example, but most of them, with the exception of Lefebvre, most of them are not interested in the doctrinal questions, but they are interested in church reform. They want to see the church cleaned up. They want to see morals fixed. All of those kinds of things. Yeah. And humanism then becomes the foundation. This new approach. It was called the New Learning in the period. This new way of studying text becomes standard in both the Catholic and Protestant worlds. By the 17th century, really by the late 16th century, this is overwhelmingly the way education is being done, and it shapes what happens going forward. Now, jumping ahead, we're going to get to the 20th century eventually.
Jumping
ahead a few hundred years, the 19th century historians, number one, they are heavily influenced by the scientism of the era. They're heavily influenced by modernity, where they are seeing progress as being sort of the nature of history. History is really built around progress, and things are going to be getting better and better and better. And they start asking questions like, what is the origin of the modern world? When did we escape from the Dark Ages? When did we escape from the ignorance of the medieval times? And they look at the Renaissance and they say, these great artists and all of this is the foundation of modern society. This is the point in which people escape from the shackles of the Middle Ages. This is the time when people saw themselves as individuals rather than as a member of a tribe or culture or whatever. I mean, there's this whole series of things that creates what I refer to as the myth of the Renaissance.
Yeah.
And they looked at the Renaissance humanista, the Renaissance humanists, and they said, this is what we are. We are also humanists because, Pico della Mirandola is quoting an ancient... Pico? Yeah. Pico's quoting an ancient author in his oration that cites the statement, man is the measure of all things.
Yeah.
And this is what we believe, and Pico's on our side. Now, they completely misunderstand what Pico meant when he used that, but this creates modern humanism. It leads to what we call secular humanism, the idea that humanity is the one who judges everything, who sets the standards for everything, and everything is measured by us, and we don't need God or anything outside of ourselves. It produces this purely secular, frankly, triumphalistic mindset that is the essence of modern humanism. And when you look back at the battles evangelicals are fighting against humanism, what they see is secular humanism. And when anybody talks about humanism or describes themselves as a humanist, they see themselves, they see that as referring to the secular vision of the world. This is why Francis Schaeffer got the Renaissance so wrong.
Well, and it is interesting that evangelicals today, in many cases, have embraced, it's kind of what Charles Taylor will later call exclusive humanism, is everything there is about their best life now, everything's contained within the secular, the immanent frame, as Taylor puts it. But so they've in many ways adopted the very vision. They've just put a Christian gloss around it. Maybe there's something beyond this life, but mainly me having, Christianity is a great therapy for me to have my best way of carrying it out. But this is an outgrowth of that long trajectory.
Yeah, that's the irony, I would say, Tom, that even the people who were vociferously denouncing humanism back in the 70s and 80s when I was a young Christian were what you just described. They were already humanistic in the sense that you described, even though they were, dead set against, humanism. But this is an important qualification: secular humanism, of the type that it was the Humanist Declaration, the Secular
Humanist Manifesto.
Yes.
So what was that?
Kurt
1980,
Kurtz, wasn't it? Or Paul? Was it what was his name?
Yeah, Paul Kurtz was he was at University of Buffalo, I think. He was a famous atheist, I remember. Yeah, people like him and Asimov and all those guys. Mm-hmm. So that was what people thought of. But today, I just finished reading not too long ago, Ray Kurzweil's book, The Singularity is Nearer When We Merge with AI. And he's dead set against humanism. He talks about fundamentalist humanism. What he means by that is nature has meaning. And so bodies have meaning and human beings have significance. I think it's Thrasymachus who's responsible for man as the measure, if I remember correctly.
I forgot who it was originally. Now, like I said, Pico did not mean by it what the 19th century humanists thought he meant by it. His is embedded in a Platonic hierarchy of being and the radical freedom of man to place himself anywhere on that hierarchy of being he chooses by what he decides to love. I mean, so it's a really different way of thinking embedded in a theologically oriented view of the world, which the 19th century humanists don't have. I want to get back to Schaeffer for a moment, because I think Schaeffer was one of the guys who really launched this anti-humanist idea into evangelicalism. And I've got a lot of respect for Schaeffer. I mean, there's an entire generation of evangelical scholars who owe their start to him. I'm probably at about the tail end of that. So I have a lot of respect for him. And Schaeffer is really good when dealing with his current era. The further back he goes, the more confused he gets, frankly. And the reason for that, I mean, I can understand it. When he was educated, the myth of the Renaissance from the 19th century that saw it as pagan, as secular, and all of those kinds of things was what he had been taught.
Yeah.
So this was his understanding of the Renaissance there. And he picked up on the idea that the 19th century humanists were claiming their origins in the Renaissance. So he was responding and interpreting the past in light of his own education. But
Glenn,
Renaissance scholarship has advanced quite a bit since then.
But maybe a good thing, because a lot of times this debate plays in the Erasmus debate, because I think a lot of people see that as the pivoting, Erasmus taking kind of that reform the church, but not in the Reformation kind of way, the humanist way. And that becomes a foil for reading everything that is bad about the old humanism.
Yeah, the humanists were pretty optimistic about human ability. That much is true. And so the debate between Luther and Erasmus was over free will, over whether or not human beings can do anything to please God. Luther said, absolutely not. We're too corrupted by sin. Erasmus said, well, yeah, we're corrupted by sin, but there are some good things we can do. And by our choices, we can advance toward acceptance by God because we can do good things.
Yeah.
And that's fundamentally the argument between the two. So they were generally optimistic about human ability. It's one of the other things that will separate them from the Protestants, both Lutheran and Reformed. Okay, so all of that is background for the article that we're looking at here, because what Brad Birzer is pointing to is a movement a new form of Christian humanism that is arising in the 20th century as a response to secular humanism. It's in the early to mid 20th century where we're really seeing this. And it's a fairly long article, but he sees 3 points. Well, first of all, he notes that there's a lot of differences between these guys. They generally got along personally, but they had sharp disagreements on exactly what the solution to the problem of modernity was. But he says there are 3 different points that they have in common. So I'll just read these off. In their many works of faith and scholarship, these men analyzed and explained the innumerable terrors of the 20th century. Remember, this is after World War I and even World War II. and argued that the solution to such horrors was really quite simple: to reclaim our faith in God, to embrace the moral and beautiful image found in each soul, and to reclaim his gift to us, our humanity. So it is a theologically oriented vision based on, well, to put it in terms that I would use, based on a recognition of God, of the natural law, the moral structure of the universe, and the image of God in each person.
And Glenn, it's probably good to add, maybe it's in there. I did read the article, but I don't know if I caught it. But one of the other things that a lot of these figures recognized is, one, there isn't a going back prior to the modern world. And there are good things the modern world gave us that we can't jettison. One of these was the fact that human beings are agents, and they are active and creative. This was something that was different than some of the classical theologies that were indebted strictly to contemplation, is they didn't talk about that we have an artistic and a humanistic role in contributing to culture and its transformation. And this becomes a new emphasis that is indebted to this tradition, and they saw it as valuable.
Well, yeah, you can see this in the epilogue to Lewis's Discarded Image, where he says, look, modernity's happened. We can't go back to the medieval image, but there are things we can retrieve from it to plug the holes that were created by modernity. Because the medieval vision of the world wasn't disproven, it was thrown out because people started asking different questions.
We can have an alternative modernity, is the way some theologians put it.
And that actually points to the second thing that Birzer identifies. Each of these Christian humanists also saw continuity in the classical and medieval traditions of the West. Though deeply respectful to the great pagans of antiquity, such as Socrates, Plato, Zeno, Cicero, and Virgil, each desired a well-ordered Christian society rooted in the ancient traditions of Athens and Rome and informed by the moral and ethical rules as understood from St. Paul to John of Salisbury, and expressed most successfully in the Anglo-Saxon traditions of government, common law, and inherited rights. So what they're looking at here is now we're dealing with these guys in primarily the Anglophone world, okay? But what he's saying is that they recognize the value of the good things brought from the pagan world, shaped and reformed by Christian moral and ethical vision. And as they see it, best expressed in the best traditions of the Anglo-Saxon world, in rule of law, governance, all of those kinds of things. So that's a second element here. We've got a return to God and a return to theology, but we've also got an understanding and a respect for tradition. And going back to the pagan world, that is an element that produced the West at its best.
And I think that's something that you see there, is this recapturing of the holistic vision of the Christian faith. That it was the Christianization of Hellenism. It was the Christianization of these things. Christianity had now stamped these things. Even classic learning was basically a technical vocabulary that Christianity was going to utilize to its own purposes and creates culture that way. But it is what it was there, and it is what is necessary for the comprehensive vision of Christianity to unpack. And so they understand how big this vision is. The literature, the arts, the forms of education are all part of Christianity now.
You're right. And that actually brings up the third point. You lead right into it. Finally, as the label Christian humanist suggests, remember, humanism started actually as an educational reform movement as far back as the Renaissance. As the label Christian humanist suggests, each defended liberal education as the only true form of education. The liberal arts, which connected ancient to medieval to modern man, liberated one from the immediate problems of this earth, connected each person to a greater continuity that transcended time and space. Okay. So again, the idea, we've talked about the difference between the liberal and the servile arts. The liberal arts being ones that lead to greater liberty, but are basically designed to not to perform practical functions like learning how to repair a computer or something, but instead lead to a freeing of the person in a much broader sense, liberating their mind, liberating their expanding their vision.
Their ethical enactment. I mean, that's a big one for them. Yeah.
Well,
I think those kinds of things.
Yeah, this brings up something that's something of a, it's a sad irony, and that is that not even people in higher education get this anymore.
Right.
Almost everybody justifies spending, $150,000 on an education by what job you get when you come out, as opposed to the education being an end in itself. Or you think about it like this: you could say, amanuensis, when somebody, in antiquity was freed, maybe purchased his own freedom.
Manumission.
Yeah, that's right. That's manumission. Amanuensis is a guy who's like you're dictating to. Yeah. Right. Thanks for the correction. But with manumission, you're paying in order to be free. There was plenty of work before you were free. When you were a slave, you had lots of things to do, but what you didn't have was freedom. Yeah. And you were, willing to pay a price for freedom. And what we're talking about is a kind of freedom that the liberal arts are intended to, inculcate and be realized in the student. And people just don't value that. They don't think about an education as being justified, or the expense of an education being justified just for freedom's sake.
Yeah. By the way, on amanuensis, just a quick side note. I saw a quote from G.K. Chesterton the other day, who said that in feminism, women said that they refused to be dictated to by men and then became stenographers.
Most of the time, taking notes from men.
Exactly. Now, okay, so these three things. Now, by the way, as far as he's concerned, Birzer is concerned, the Inklings are a prime example of these Christian humanists.
Yeah.
And he notes that even the Inklings had strong disagreements with each other, but they still remained friends, and they still, met together, and they still talked, and they still had at least these three things in common that I just read off. He notes, though, that the biggest, the main division that he notes here is between the Neotomists, the followers of Aquinas, and the Augustinians. And as someone who has studied medieval history a fair amount, I found this rather interesting, because Thomas was very influenced by Augustine, but he was also very influenced by Aristotle. And that begins to create
the Neotomists tend to run with kind of those, what others will argue, unhealthy directions that Aquinas probably wouldn't have gone. And I think they get labeled. Now, a Neotomist would say that's not true to them, but that's sometimes the criticism, that they've left that dimension that is indebted to Plato and even Augustine.
This reminds me of The Dumb Ox by Chesterton, because in that, he ends his biography of Thomas with an account of Luther burning the Summa. I don't know if you remember that, but of course Luther was an Augustinian monk, and there's a way of reading the Reformation as kind of the Augustinian revolt against the new school.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I think it was B.B. Warfield said that the Reformation represented the triumph of Augustine's doctrine of grace over Augustine's doctrine of the church.
Yeah. Well, in the Franciscans and their reforms and their voluntarism, they paid the Augustinian voluntarism played a big role in that. You could probably say the Augustinian notion of the will and the Augustinian notion of the intellect. Those two got pitted against.
In the Reformation, I think it's one. I think that perhaps many of our listeners who maybe just have never been introduced to kind of the history of theology might be startled to think of like a person like Calvin is not just simply a biblical commentator, but actually an advocate for the Augustinian school.
Yeah,
right. He's in that school along with Luther and the other reformers.
You can actually trace what Calvin was reading when you read chronologically through his writings, because you can see how different influences come in.
Yeah.
And he used a lot of the church fathers, but overwhelmingly Augustine.
Yeah,
Right.
and
So,
Chrysostom, yeah.
yeah. So one of the things that he notes is that the Augustinians really didn't like the Augustinians in our period, the Christian humanist Augustinians, didn't like the way that the Neotomists tended to make everything an intellectual. It's all about the intellect. Distrust emotion, distrust anything that isn't reason.
Yeah.
So that's going to be one of the dividing points here. One of the great Augustinians, a historian I have a great deal of respect for, was Christopher Dawson. He wrote some fabulous works on medieval history and theology.
And I know Birzer loves Dawson. He's a big fan of Dawson.
And there's a very good reason to love Dawson. My two favorite medieval historians are R.W. Southern and Dawson. I mean, and both of them are writing in this period. But he says, just as Dawson thought that the Neotomists were too abstract and theoretical, if not outright ideological, the Neotomists thought little of Dawson, considering him a, quote, mere historian, a recorder rather than a creator.
Yeah.
How does that make you feel, Glenn?
Well, I mean, it's what is utterly bizarre there is the sophistication of Dawson's thought that they just simply dismissed. Yeah. So neither side held a lot of, really held the other in a great deal of respect in some ways, but they're still working toward a kind of common purpose, just coming at it from different directions.
Yeah, yeah. Now, those two directions have pretty much dominated both Catholic and Protestant thought for ages. I mean, that's really where your differing camps, how you balance those figures is where those camps come, where your camp comes out.
Well, thinking about Brad, I mean, Brad's a friend. I know of his love for Dawson, and also his love for Tolkien. Thinking of the Inklings, I didn't get a chance to read the article. Does he spend any time trying to identify where the Inklings are? I'm assuming that, Lewis is an Augustinian. Does Brad consider a Tolkien an Augustinian in light of this?
I think, I don't remember whether it was Brad's book. No, it wasn't. There's another book that I read that sees Tolkien very much as a Neo-Thomist.
Yeah, I've always associated with him more of the Thomist outlook.
Yeah, but he is definitely not he is definitely Thomism is its own. You could spend 15 shows on it, and there are different. But there's the kind of Ed Feser kind of neo-Thomism, which is kind of like the post. There's different schools. It almost sounds like intellectual logarithms. I don't think Tolkien is in that. I'm not saying you can't appreciate him and like Tolkien. I'm just saying I think Tolkien, especially with his emphasis on language and things like that, it would be closer to someone that could find a humanistic strand in that kind of Thomism. I think de Lubeck is interesting because, these are ressourcement Catholics because they wed certain Augustinian Augustinian readings of Aquinas. Maybe here's just one small way of putting it. The natural desire for God. Even with Thomism, you have the Augustinian one that will say that we can't be complete without that theological end, that you can't bracket it out. Some Neo-Thomism will say that you have a completely this worldly end, and then it can finally be capped off into an extra worldly end with God. So you can have a secular, if you will, but you can also have an ultimately supernatural purpose in life. They get wedded together in the humanism of Augustine, where the divine is going to play a much richer picture in your cultural humanism than certain kind of neo-Thomists who can have a almost secular view, even though a Christian view will cap it off.
Now, what I'm about to say might not be justified, but it's interesting that Tolkien's sometimes criticized because there's no explicit religious dimension to, say, The Lord of the Rings. Now, you can't say that about, say, the Silmarillion, because you're actually starting with God. But when it comes to like the story, there's no place in The Lord of the Rings, for example, or even The Hobbit, where you can say, "Oh, there's something religious going on." Now, if you're thinking about sort of the story itself, you can say, "Okay, it's suffused with a."
There is kind of a teleology. There is, But you're right. It is less.
But no one would ever say that about the Chronicles of Narnia, and everybody would say, that's just an allegory.
Well, Tolkien's response is this is sort of prehistory of Earth in a lot of ways, and thus God hadn't yet revealed Himself to Abraham.
Yeah, right.
So that's how he explained that. The closest you get to it is some of Gandalf's statements, which could be interpreted as fate, but also in the window on the west, where they do their ritual before the meal, where they look to the west, to Numenor, that was, and beyond that to the Undying Lands. That's as close as you get in The Lord of the Rings.
Right.
So, I did find a paragraph on the Inklings that may partly answer your question. Even within Lewis's group at Oxford, the Inklings, there was much disagreement. When American scholar Charles Moorman wrote of the Inklings as a collective entity, Warnie Lewis recorded in his diary, quote, "I smiled at the thought of Toller," said as Tolkien, "being under the influence of Moorman's group mind." Still, sometime member Owen Barfield thought a group mind, at least in terms of purpose, might be ideal. One should pursue, quote, "the sober effort to build up and maintain a common stock of thought rather than to startle with a series of sparkling individual contributions," he wrote in 1940. To promote truth and defend the ideals of the West, Barfield continued, a group of men should create, quote, "a commonwealth of the spirit in which there is no copyright."
Yeah.
So,
I was thinking about the Inklings. One of the things about it, of course, that makes it so different than, say, your typical artists group, where our writers group that gets together to read each other their stuff, is these guys were all world-class intellectuals,
right?
And usually in a little writing group, you got a pretty uneven collection of minds and abilities and stuff like that, because we're trying to do it with people that we're around, as opposed to being in Oxford.
Yeah. Well, that is and the thing is, that's interesting from the article is how immersed they were in the differing figures, especially the Catholic figures like Gilson and Mariton. I mean, they were able to hold their engagements with that, even if that wasn't their direct field. In a few of them, it was. But it's interesting because, Mariton did a lot with. Besides the philosophical stuff, he did a lot with art and contemplation in art. And they're very good. Even today, they're read very, very much by people wanting to get that kind of a good balance on those things for something lost. But it's interesting to hear they were fighting over whether or not these people were,
Oh, yeah.
had their pulse on the right thing.
Yeah, they were, not just reading, figures from the past. They were aware of what was going on around them. They were reading stuff.
By the way, it's worth noting that they were not overly fond of America. Dawson didn't like Marytown, but he says Dawson does not know Marytown personally, but he believes that his residence in the United States has spoiled both his language and his thought. In the latter, he has made too much emphasis on political issues. In the former, he's become quite a poor prose writer, obscurely replacing his former clarity. And then when it comes to T.S. Eliot, some of them were disappointed that he didn't go all the way to Catholicism. And someone commented that his ability, his propensity for conversion stopped when he became English.
It's kind of well known that Eliot and Tolkien, there was some tension there. I mean, not Tolkien. I mean Lewis. Yeah, at least from Lewis's perspective, he didn't like his work much at all. But I think they kind of made up a bit or became friends over the prayer book. I think they were working on that together.
Yeah, and eventually they sort of patched it up. Yeah,
that's interesting. Yeah.
So, On the political end, we see this. The question of politics also divided Christian humanists in the 20th century. This is really interesting.
Yeah.
Maritain and his brand of Neotomists were generally much more pro-liberal and pro-democracy than were the Augustinians, especially Dawson and Kirk, neither of whom held any fondness for mass democracy. In this, the Augustinian sided with Plato, seeing much of democracy as nothing more than animalistic mob action, a dangerous loosening of the passions.
There's something to be said for that. The problem is we, when it comes to the elites that we live with today, it's a very different breed than the ones they knew.
Yeah.
The elites that we live with parade as though they're, everyman. When in fact they're just kind of using the latest, I guess, intellectual fad to further their own, I guess, privileges or status.
And they promote ideas that they don't follow.
That's it. Yeah.
And then when what happens is the poor end up following these ideas, which keeps them locked in poverty where they're doing other things.
Yeah, Rob Henderson in his book Troubled gets into that a bit. He talks about what's the term he uses.
Luxury beliefs?
Luxury beliefs, that's it, yeah.
Yeah. So, for example, they're disparaging of marriage and all of that sort of thing. Every one of them is in a stable marriage, pretty much.
That's right, right.
Yeah. Well, there are some exceptions, but...
Sure.
So... I found the comments about democracy particularly interesting in light of all of the discussion about threats to democracy, primarily coming from the left, but also to some extent from the right.
Right.
So it does raise the question. Aristotle considered democracy a degenerate form of government because he saw what real democracy in Athens looked like and where it led. He was much more in favor of republican government. The difference being republics are governed by representation, democracies are governed by direct popular action.
Yeah, it's interesting, too, to note that Aristotle noted that there are different forms of government and there's a good expression and a bad expression of each.
Right.
So in Aristotle, it can become an oligarchy, a monarchy can become a tyranny. And
Right.
That's right.
And then in political theory, the ideal form of government is a mixture of as many of them as you can put together in a stable arrangement, which is what the American Constitution, to the Enlightenment thinkers, did admirably. The president is the monarchical principle, the Senate is the aristocratic principle, and the House is the Republican principle. It is, after all, the House of Representatives.
Right.
So now the thing that this got me thinking about is the idea of hierarchy, because I am sure the Augustinians are looking at this from the perspective of not mob action, not mass democracy, but some sort of hierarchical system. I would really have liked to have seen Birzer talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Right.
But the idea that there might be some form of hierarchy as a natural good in society is something that is patently obvious in terms of how we actually live, but is a forbidden idea in terms of how we actually talk.
Well, that's exactly. I think it's. It seems to me that if you have any standard, you're going to have a hierarchy, because there are going to be some people who live more up to or closer to the ideal that the standard is holding up than others. And so this is one of the reasons, of course, why we dismiss objective standards in education now, because it sorts people out. Some people actually fail.
Right. And worse, some people succeed.
Yeah.
That's right.
People can forgive failure. Right. They can't forgive success.
That's right. Yeah. That's a very, very important point. I agree.
Yeah. Adrian Pabst, too, is he's kind of a British theological and political philosopher. And he did, a couple of years back, a book called Metaphysical Hierarchy. talking about kind of the metaphysical substructures of reality and then politics. And he is really about from ground up showing the way in which this is built right into the fabric of reality. There's no way of getting out of it. And then, of course, you had, England, you had Richard Hooker, the famous Anglican theologian, with his laws of the, ecclesial, the whole order of things, the hierarchy of things. And then it goes all the way back, of course, to, pseudo Dennis, the Dennis,
the Areopagite,
the Areopagite, right?
Right.
The way in which, though, reality, whether you like those particular ways of doing it, there's no getting away from those kinds of realities and purposes and values and goods, and them being ordered in particular ways, and ones that allow for the humane to take place, or those that stifle it and suffocate it. And then, that's one of the things that, I think the Christian humanism really tries, when it's doing its best thing, to get a hold of, is the place of humanity within that. That's what got lost with a lot of the fascisms and the totalitarianisms and everything else, and bad political orderings. And these are the things that I think they recognized, if we don't get back a hold of the real goods that are in reality, through technology and the way in which things are advancing in terms of the capacity to do serious damage, is at stake. So I think there was a lot more at stake with what Lewis was up to, Tolkien, and these other Christian humanists, than merely just their fascination with these topics and subjects, even though they were experts. I think they realized humanity was at stake.
Well, that's the abolition of man. That's the title of the book.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Now, when we think about, sort of the practical realities of distinctions in societies, where, there are people who have, a position that is commanding in nature, and they have authority. The ideal, of course, is that they have the virtues requisite to actually carry out their work, the work that people are depending on them for. And when we think about virtues, there's the practical side, which is the ability to get things done. But there's also the moral character when it comes to virtue of the people we're talking about, and there's historically been kind of a tension here, right? Because when you're virtuous in the sense that you have the ability to, say, win in a fight because you're courageous and strong, those are your virtues. But you're also contemptuous and dismissive and really nasty. There are some vices that are attendant as well that maybe are the temptations that a courageous, strong man is going to feel, that other people who are not courageous and strong wouldn't be tempted to feel. But then other virtues will have other attendant temptations, if you see what I'm getting at. So I think that we're getting at the problem of success, how it has a way of engendering resentment, but among the people who didn't succeed, and resentment. That idea that there's this sort of ongoing sort of animus that it just is applied to everybody in a particular class who may. So how we kind of hold that all together, how we work with it. I see on the one hand people who talk about the moral virtues at the expense of these heroic virtues, in other words, ability, excellence, that kind of stuff. And then I see other people who talk about those virtues at the expense of the moral virtues. You could kind of say it's the woke versus the libertarians, right? Yeah. On the one hand, it just depends on which virtues they are, holding up as being most important.
Yeah. Now, another way of looking at this is, we have to hold in tension a couple of different things. First of all, Scripture does talk about all people as being spiritually and morally equal before God. We're all sinners. We're all saved the same way. So we've got to have that there. So we need to preserve a sense of equality on that level. We also have to recognize that because of sin, people with, Lord Acton's dictum, power tends to corrupt, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So when you have a hierarchy of some sort, the fear that is really in place in America, the assumption automatically is if you have any kind of a hierarchy, the people on the top of the hierarchy are going to abuse everybody else. They're going to take advantage of their position and so on. And so there's a distrust of hierarchy and an insistence on equality. The problem is hierarchy is inevitable. And actually, if you look at our elites in society, you see exactly the problem. There's corruption, but you can't avoid it. The hierarchy is going to always be there. So the question is, how do you preserve the equality and the equal rights of the individual while having a hierarchy, which is going to happen anyway? And how do you try to keep the hierarchy under control? How do you structure that? That's actually what the U.S. Constitution was designed around, those core ideas.
Right. So, you can see it in education, for example, here in Oregon, that there's the notorious effort to eliminate failure by eliminating the possibility of success. So, in other words, we'll say math is racist, and that immediately excuses anybody who doesn't perform well in math, particularly if they're not white or Asian.
And the people who push that idea put their kids in private schools.
Oh, that's it.
Yeah,
that's
and
right.
they're the ones who know math so well to create the technologies that everyone else becomes dependent on, and then you see how it goes.
Right.
It's a great example of a luxury belief.
Yeah.
They'll push that idea, but they will not live by it. They won't put their kids in the schools that learn that kind of garbage.
Yeah. But we see a kind of a vacillation back and forth, almost kind of schizophrenically in our society. So, 5 years ago, it was the woke insanity that was assailant, it was ascendant. Now there's been a correction. We're going to say, okay, standards are important and we need them. And so consequently, the same rules for everybody. And we're not going to play favorites anymore. Even though, the favoritism of the woke was if you didn't do well in school, it just shouldn't hold you back. But there is a potential that you end up with a situation, which I do think is the case, particularly with people who are very accomplished, where they really do think of themselves as being all that and everybody else as being worthless or next to worthless. And how do you hold together? I know what you do is, you have a Christian outlook, which is what you were saying earlier, Glenn.
Yeah.
But that's the only way you can hold it together. Yeah, I don't think the woke or the libertarian views are viable.
It's the perennial problem of college professors who are an expert in one field, so they assume they're experts in all fields. It sort of reminds me, Bobby Fischer, the chess master.
Oh yeah,
he used to play multiple chess matches simultaneously, just move from table to table to table and slaughter people. He'd be playing like 20 games at once.
Yeah.
At one point, he was in a casino and he played a slot machine and he lost. So he got upset. He got everybody out of the room and he proceeded to try to play all the slots, just like he was doing a multiple chess match. It didn't work out for him.
Well, he was now speak about a guy that had a kind of contempt for the human race. That was that guy. I mean, he was pretty full of himself.
Yeah. But it's interesting. This is something we're not going to have time to go into, but it is something that coming from those the emphasis in curriculum, whether it was the humanities or just classical curriculum as a whole, is the strong place of memory and the significance of it, which I think, especially in education today, with our dependencies on everything from the computer and the phone to look everything up, you just don't have to memorize much anymore, and what that does to a large population, and then the political manipulatability of that as well. And it's that's a cocktail for that would be the kind of question, if I were sitting at the table with those guys at this end of history, what their political and view would be like, their Christian humanistic political view would look like with that kind of mean, they were still trying to retrieve things and develop things so that we wouldn't end up in this situation. And here we are.
Yeah. Well, we've come to that point where we should start to wrap things up here. This was a fun conversation. Is there anything we didn't get to, Glenn, that you want to make sure we?
Those were the main points. I think, though, that what I would say is that the vision of the Christian humanists, I think, was good. And the diversity of ideas, their disagreements with each other, that was perfectly fine. That was good as well. It would be nice if we were in a situation where we could see a revival of this kind of thinking for our generation. Because what they were doing was important, and we've got a lot to learn from it. But we're in a very different world than they were. And I think that the goals, the ideas, the core things that they were after are things that are worth, in our own way, retrieving.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we have, of course, the Inklings, and they're, giants intellectually, but also artistically. Mm-hmm. And that's where I wonder, that's what I wonder about, whether or not we can have a recovery of the kind of humanism we're talking about here without both and. In other words, we've got intellectuals who never tire of telling us to pursue to value the transcendentals, truth, goodness, beauty, but they're just not very proficient in the arts themselves.
Right. Yeah. But it's also worth noting the Christian humanists were only proficient in literary arts. You don't see these guys doing visual arts, for example, or music.
Yeah, that's a good point. Anyway, well, thanks for the subject matter there, Glenn. Anything you want to say, Tom, as we wrap up?
No, I think I've said enough.
All right. Well, thank you for listening to this episode of the Theology Pugcast. And if you'd like to support our work, there is a link in the show notes to our Patreon page. And we really do appreciate all the folks who give on a monthly basis to make this show possible. Anyway, thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Westminster Presbyterian Church in Battleground, Washington. The Theology Pugcast is produced and edited by Wiley Craft Productions of Nashville, Tennessee.